November 12, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The freight train's whistle pierced the cold morning air as another cargo of German prisoners stepped onto American soil for the first time. Sergeant Klaus Weber stumbled from the boxcar, his Wehrmacht uniform now marked with the stark white letters PW that branded him as property of the U.S. Army. The smell hit him immediately, something sweet and unfamiliar drifting from the camp kitchens, nothing like the cabbage soup and black bread that had sustained him through 3 years of war. Weber's stomach cramped with hunger as he joined the line of prisoners shuffling toward the mess hall. Around him, guard towers rose like concrete sentinels against the Texas sky, their silhouettes sharp against the morning light. American soldiers in clean uniforms directed the procession with casual efficiency, their faces showing neither hatred nor sympathy, just the routine professionalism of men processing another shipment of enemy combatants. Inside the mess hall, Weber stopped short, the serving line stretched before him like nothing he had ever seen in military service. American cooks ladled thick stews onto metal trays, piled white bread rolls beside portions of meat that seemed impossibly generous, and offered drinks that looked more like dessert than sustenance. The prisoner ahead of him stared at a glass filled with pink liquid topped with white foam, turning it in his hands as if examining some alien artifact. Weber had grown up on hearty German fare, dense rye bread, potato dumplings, bratwurst thick with fat, sauerkraut that lasted through winter months. These were serious foods for serious people, meals that filled the belly and sustained hard work. What the Americans offered looked like children's treats, soft buns that compressed under the slightest pressure, meat patties swimming in grease, and drinks so sweet they made his teeth ache just from the smell. He accepted his tray with skepticism, wondering if this was some elaborate form of psychological warfare. Could the enemy's soldiers ever imagine finding paradise in a milkshake? German prisoners arriving in America carried with them food traditions that had shaped their culture for centuries. The German diet represented values of substance and endurance, meals built around potatoes, cabbage, root vegetables, and heavy grains that could sustain laborers through long winters and difficult harvests. Even before the war, German cuisine emphasized hearty portions of dense, nutritious foods that reflected the practical mentality of a people who valued efficiency and sustenance over indulgence. War rationing in Germany had made these traditional foods even more precious. By 1944, German civilians were surviving on 1,412 calories per day, consisting mainly of ersatz coffee made from acorns, bread mixed with sawdust, and soups stretched thin with turnips and potato peels. German soldiers in the field received slightly better rations, but even military meals consisted of dark bread, preserved meats, and vegetables pickled to last through campaign seasons. The concept of food as pleasure rather than necessity had been systematically eliminated from German wartime culture. American food culture presented a complete contrast to Germanic traditions. The United States in 1944 was experiencing unprecedented abundance, with agricultural production reaching levels that amazed even American officials. While Europe struggled with rationing, American civilians consumed an average of 3,300 calories per day, including luxuries like white sugar, fresh milk, and red meat that had disappeared from European tables. The American military feeding system reflected this abundance, providing soldiers with rations that would have seemed impossible to European armies. The scale of American food production defied German understanding of agricultural possibilities. The United States was producing 4.2 billion pounds of beef annually, enough to provide every person in America with a quarter-pound hamburger every day. Dairy farms generated 117 billion pounds of milk yearly, supporting an ice cream industry that produced flavors and varieties unknown in Europe. Sugar refineries processed 8.4 million tons of sugar annually, supporting a confectionery industry that treated sweetness as a basic right rather than a rare luxury. German prisoners of war represented the first large-scale exposure of European military personnel to American food abundance. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States housed more than 425,000 German POWs in camps scattered across the country, from Texas to New York, from California to Georgia. These camps became inadvertent laboratories for cultural exchange, where traditional German attitudes toward food encountered American concepts of abundance and variety. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive the same rations as their captors' troops, which meant that German POWs suddenly found themselves eating better than they had since before the war began. American military rations included fresh meat, white bread, butter, sugar, and processed foods that represented technological achievements unknown in wartime Europe. German prisoners discovered canned fruits, packaged cookies, carbonated beverages, and dairy products that had been considered luxury items even in peacetime Germany. American camp commanders quickly learned that food represented more than nutrition for their German prisoners. It was a powerful tool for psychological adjustment and morale management. Camps that provided generous, varied meals experienced fewer disciplinary problems and better cooperation from prisoners. German POWs who initially refused American food on principle gradually accepted it from necessity, then began to anticipate and even request specific American dishes. The cultural collision between German food traditions and American abundance created psychological tensions that surprised both prisoners and captors. Many German POWs initially interpreted American food generosity as weakness, assuming that a nation soft enough to pamper its enemies could not possess the hardness necessary for victory. Others saw American abundance as proof of decadence, evidence that Americans had traded martial virtue for material comfort. However, prolonged exposure to American food abundance gradually altered German prisoners' understanding of their captors and their nation. The realization that America could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than Germany fed its own civilians challenged fundamental assumptions about American society and capabilities. German POWs began to understand that they were experiencing the edges of an industrial and agricultural system that operated on scales they had never imagined. The psychological impact of American food on German prisoners extended beyond immediate nutrition to questions of identity and ideology. Many German POWs had been taught that Americans were weak, materialistic, and incapable of the sacrifices necessary for military victory. The discovery that America could provide abundance even to its enemies while maintaining massive military operations across multiple theaters forced painful reconsiderations of Nazi propaganda and German assumptions about their enemies. American military authorities recognized the strategic value of demonstrating abundance to German prisoners. Well-fed POWs became informal ambassadors for American values, writing letters to families in Germany that described American generosity and abundance. These testimonies, filtered through German postal censors, provided German civilians with their first accurate information about American capabilities and intentions. The psychological warfare value of feeding German prisoners generously was immense. It demonstrated American strength through kindness rather than cruelty. The food experiences of German POWs in America would have lasting historical consequences that extended far beyond individual prisoners' memories. These men would return to post-war Germany carrying knowledge of American abundance and food culture that would influence European attitudes toward American products and values for decades. The seeds of post-war cultural exchange were planted in POW camp mess halls, where German prisoners first tasted hamburgers and milkshakes. December 3, 1944. Camp Alva, Oklahoma. The mess hall buzzed with nervous energy as German prisoners lined up for their first encounter with what American cooks called burger night. Sergeant Weber joined the queue, watching as prisoners ahead of him received metal trays loaded with food he couldn't identify. The aroma filling the hall was unlike anything from German military kitchens, sweet, greasy, somehow both foreign and compelling. When Weber reached the serving line, an American cook with flour-dusted hands placed a sandwich on his tray that defied every concept of military nutrition Weber had ever learned. Two soft white buns enclosed a thick patty of ground beef, topped with yellow cheese that gleamed under the mess hall lights. Beside it sat a small paper cup filled with what looked like fried potato strips and a tall glass containing thick, pink liquid crowned with white foam that sparkled in the artificial light. Weber carried his tray to a wooden table where other German prisoners sat in various stages of bewilderment. Obergefreiter Fritz Dietrich, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, held his hamburger at arm's length like it might explode. "This is not food," Dietrich muttered in German. "This is what children eat at carnivals." Around him, other prisoners prodded their hamburgers with suspicion, comparing them unfavorably to the substantial meals they remembered from peacetime Germany. The first bite changed everything. Weber bit into his hamburger expecting disappointment, but discovered flavors that overwhelmed his preconceptions. The beef was tender and juicy, seasoned with spices he couldn't identify. The cheese melted across his tongue with a richness that German prisoners hadn't experienced since before rationing began. The soft bun absorbed the meat's juices, creating a combination of textures that somehow worked, despite violating every principle of German cuisine. Around Weber, other prisoners underwent similar conversions. Dietrich, who had loudly proclaimed hamburgers unfit for serious men, quietly finished his entire portion and glanced toward the serving line to see if seconds were available. Unteroffizier Hans Zimmermann, a former baker from Munich, examined his hamburger with professional interest, recognizing quality ingredients prepared with techniques he hadn't considered possible. But the real revelation came with the milkshakes. Weber approached his pink beverage with deep skepticism, expecting something sickeningly sweet and childish. The first sip delivered a shock of flavor that redefined his understanding of what food could be. The drink was indeed sweet, but with a complexity that balanced cream, fruit, and sugar in proportions that seemed almost engineered for pleasure. The texture was unlike anything he had experienced, thick enough to require effort through the straw, cold enough to numb his tongue, rich enough to feel substantial. The transformation in the mess hall was visible and immediate. Prisoners who had entered with the dignity of defeated soldiers began behaving like men, discovering treasure. They compared flavors, argued about techniques, and speculated about ingredients with the intensity of military strategists planning campaigns. Weber watched as Sergeant Friedrich Bauer, a strict disciplinarian who had never shown interest in anything beyond duty, attempted to drink his milkshake slowly to make it last longer. The American guards observed this transformation with amusement and some surprise. Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, supervising the evening meal, had expected German prisoners to reject American food as inferior to their own traditions. Instead, he watched enemy soldiers who had fought American forces across Europe now clustering around the serving line, attempting to communicate their appreciation through gestures and broken English. By the end of the meal, German prisoners were sketching hamburger construction in notebooks, trying to understand the engineering that made such food possible. Weber found himself drawing detailed diagrams of bun layering, meat preparation, and condiment application, as if hamburgers were military equipment requiring technical analysis. Other prisoners attempted to recreate milkshake recipes using arithmetic, calculating ratios of milk, ice cream, and flavoring that might reproduce the drinks they had just discovered. The psychological impact extended beyond the meal itself. Weber realized that the Americans were feeding their prisoners better than many German civilians had eaten in years. The abundance represented by hamburgers and milkshakes suggested resources so vast that America could afford to treat enemy soldiers as honored guests. This realization forced uncomfortable questions about German propaganda that had portrayed Americans as weak and resource-poor. Over the following weeks, hamburger and milkshake nights became anticipated events that transformed camp morale. German prisoners who had maintained strict military discipline began trading work assignments for kitchen duty, hoping to learn American cooking techniques. They wrote detailed letters to families in Germany describing American food abundance, though postal censors eliminated most specific details that might aid German intelligence. The cultural conversion accelerated as American cooks introduced German prisoners to other examples of American cuisine. Hot dogs presented another conceptual challenge. Meat products that bore no resemblance to traditional German sausages, but delivered satisfaction that exceeded familiar foods. French fries, despite their misleading name, became objects of fascination for prisoners who had grown up on boiled potatoes and sauerkraut. American camp administrators recognized the strategic value of food-based cultural exchange. Well-fed prisoners caused fewer disciplinary problems, cooperated more readily with camp regulations, and demonstrated less hostility toward their captors. The psychological warfare value was immense. German prisoners were experiencing American abundance firsthand, creating testimonies that contradicted Nazi propaganda about American weakness and decadence. Some German prisoners attempted to resist the appeal of American food, viewing their enjoyment as betrayal of German values and military discipline. These holdouts criticized fellow prisoners who requested seconds of hamburgers or milkshakes, arguing that German soldiers should maintain pride in their own traditions. However, hunger, curiosity, and the undeniable pleasure of American food gradually wore down even the most dedicated traditionalists. The conversion process was not without psychological complexity. Weber found himself experiencing guilt alongside pleasure, wondering if his enjoyment of American food represented a form of cultural surrender. He had been raised to believe that German cuisine was superior because it was practical and substantial, while American food was dismissed as frivolous and weak. The discovery that American food could be both pleasurable and satisfying challenged fundamental assumptions about national character and cultural values. By winter's end, German prisoners had developed sophisticated preferences for American foods that would have seemed impossible months earlier. They debated the merits of different milkshake flavors with the seriousness of wine connoisseurs, argued about optimal hamburger construction with engineering precision, and requested specific American dishes with the confidence of regular customers. The transformation was complete. Enemy soldiers had become enthusiastic consumers of American abundance. Within weeks of their introduction to American fast food, German prisoners began writing letters home that would profoundly influence European perceptions of American society for decades to come. Despite postal censorship, fragments of their food experiences reached German families through carefully coded language that described abundant provisions and unexpected generosity from their captors. These testimonies contradicted Nazi propaganda that portrayed Americans as resource-poor and incapable of sustaining prolonged military operations. Sergeant Weber found himself composing letters to his wife in Württemberg that struggled to convey the psychological impact of American food abundance. "The Americans feed us better than we ate in peacetime," he wrote in January 1945. "They give us meat every day, bread that is white as snow, and drinks that taste like dessert. I cannot understand how a nation can afford such generosity to its enemies while fighting wars across the entire world." German postal censors, trained to eliminate military intelligence, failed to recognize the strategic implications of such testimonies. The psychological transformation of German prisoners became visible in their daily behavior and camp interactions. American guards reported that German POWs, who had initially maintained rigid military discipline, gradually relaxed into more casual social patterns. Prisoners who had eaten meals in strict silence began engaging in animated discussions about food preferences, cooking techniques, and cultural differences. The communal experience of discovering American cuisine created bonds between former enemies that surprised both prisoners and captors. German prisoners developed sophisticated food preferences that demonstrated their rapid adaptation to American abundance. Weber and his fellow POWs began requesting specific hamburger preparations, debating the merits of different milkshake flavors, and expressing disappointment when kitchen staff served traditional German dishes instead of American fast food. Technical Sergeant Martinez observed enemy soldiers who had fought American forces across Europe now lining up eagerly for seconds of food they had initially rejected as inferior. The cultural conversion extended beyond individual meals to fundamental changes in prisoners' understanding of American society and capabilities. Weber realized that the United States possessed agricultural and industrial resources so vast that feeding prisoners generously represented no significant burden on American war production. This abundance suggested national capabilities that contradicted everything German prisoners had been taught about American weaknesses and limitations. American military authorities recognized the strategic value of food-based psychological warfare and began systematically documenting prisoner responses to different types of American cuisine. Reports to the War Department noted that camps providing generous, varied meals experienced significantly lower rates of escape attempts, disciplinary problems, and resistance to camp regulations. German prisoners, who initially planned to maintain strict military bearing, gradually accepted American hospitality as evidence of civilized treatment rather than weakness. The testimonies of German prisoners began influencing American military strategy as intelligence officers realized the propaganda value of well-fed enemy soldiers. German POWs were writing detailed accounts of American abundance that reached families throughout Germany, providing German civilians with their first accurate information about American industrial and agricultural capabilities. These testimonials contradicted Nazi propaganda more effectively than any official American broadcast could achieve. Some German prisoners experienced profound psychological conflicts as their enjoyment of American food challenged their loyalty to German values and military traditions. Weber found himself questioning Nazi teachings about American decadence while simultaneously feeling guilty about his anticipation of hamburger nights. The cognitive dissonance was painful. Enemy food had become a source of pleasure that complicated his understanding of national identity and military duty. The social dynamics within POW camps evolved as American food became a common ground for cultural exchange between former enemies. German prisoners began teaching American guards German cooking techniques while learning American food preparation methods in return. Kitchen duty, initially assigned as punishment, became a coveted opportunity for prisoners to explore American cuisine and develop relationships with their captors based on shared culinary interests. American cooks and camp administrators found themselves serving as inadvertent ambassadors for American values and culture. The generosity displayed through abundant food rations demonstrated American principles more effectively than any political lecture could achieve. German prisoners experienced American democracy through the abundance of their meals, learning that American prosperity was shared even with enemy soldiers who had fought against American forces. The economic implications of feeding German prisoners American-style meals demonstrated the vast scale of American agricultural and industrial production. The United States was providing hamburgers, milkshakes, and processed foods to more than 400,000 enemy prisoners, while simultaneously supplying Allied forces worldwide and maintaining civilian abundance at home. This triple burden would have bankrupted any European nation, but represented merely a fraction of American productive capacity. German prisoners began collecting recipes, food preparation techniques, and culinary knowledge that they planned to take back to post-war Germany. Weber and other POWs copied hamburger construction methods, milkshake recipes, and American cooking techniques into notebooks that became treasured possessions. These culinary secrets represented practical knowledge that prisoners hoped to use for economic opportunities in post-war Europe. The medical staff at American POW camps documented significant improvements in prisoner health, morale, and psychological adjustment that correlated directly with exposure to American food abundance. German prisoners who had arrived, malnourished and demoralized, gradually gained weight, developed better attitudes toward their captors, and demonstrated increased cooperation with camp regulations. The therapeutic value of abundant, varied meals proved more effective than any formal rehabilitation program. American military authorities began sharing successful POW feeding programs with British and Canadian allies, spreading American food culture throughout the Allied camp system. The standardization of generous food rations became a hallmark of Western Allied prisoner treatment that contrasted sharply with German and Japanese prisoner policies. This difference in treatment would influence post-war international law and prisoner-of-war conventions for decades to come. The long-term cultural impact of German prisoners' food experiences would extend far beyond the war itself. These men would return to post-war Germany, carrying detailed knowledge of American abundance and food culture that would influence European attitudes toward American products, values, and lifestyle for generations. The seeds of post-war cultural exchange were planted in POW camp mess halls, where enemy soldiers first discovered the pleasures of hamburgers and milkshakes. The success of American food abundance in transforming German prisoner attitudes revealed strategic capabilities that extended far beyond military nutrition to fundamental questions of national power and industrial capacity. By 1945, the United States was simultaneously feeding 12 million American military personnel, 425,000 enemy prisoners, and millions of Allied civilians, while maintaining domestic food abundance that exceeded pre-war levels. This logistical achievement demonstrated organizational capabilities that redefined concepts of national strength and resource management. American agricultural production during World War II reached levels that amazed even American officials and economists. The nation's farms produced 4.2 billion pounds of beef annually, 117 billion pounds of milk, and 8.4 million tons of processed sugar, while releasing millions of farm workers for military service and industrial production. The technological innovations that enabled this abundance, mechanized farming, improved fertilizers, hybrid crops, and industrial food processing, represented advances that would reshape global agriculture for decades to come. The industrial food processing capabilities that produced hamburgers, hot dogs, and milkshakes for German prisoners demonstrated manufacturing technologies that European nations had never achieved. American meatpacking plants could process entire cattle into standardized portions within hours. Dairy facilities could convert raw milk into dozens of different products simultaneously, and food processing factories could produce millions of uniform food items daily. These capabilities represented industrial sophistication that German prisoners had never imagined possible. The psychological warfare implications of food abundance were systematically studied and incorporated into American military doctrine. Intelligence reports documented that well-fed enemy prisoners provided more reliable information, demonstrated greater cooperation with interrogation procedures, and expressed more favorable attitudes toward American forces and values. The strategic value of generous food rations proved so significant that American military authorities standardized abundant feeding procedures across all prisoner facilities. American logistics capabilities enabled the transportation of fresh, processed foods to remote prison camps across the continental United States with efficiency that German military leaders found incomprehensible. The network of refrigerated transport, cold storage facilities, and distribution systems that delivered hamburgers and milkshakes to prisoners in Texas and Oklahoma represented technological achievements that exceeded anything available to European military forces. The economic analysis of American prisoner feeding revealed resource capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about wartime resource allocation. The United States was spending more money feeding enemy prisoners than many European nations allocated to their entire civilian food programs, while simultaneously supporting massive military operations across multiple theaters. This economic flexibility demonstrated national wealth and industrial capacity that redefined concepts of national power. German military intelligence struggled to understand the strategic implications of American food abundance when prisoner testimonies began reaching German command through prisoner exchanges and intelligence channels. German officers initially dismissed reports of generous American prisoner feeding as propaganda, unable to believe that any nation could afford such generosity while maintaining effective military operations. The truth proved even more challenging to German strategic thinking than the propaganda would have been. The technological innovations developed for military food production during World War II laid the foundation for post-war American dominance in global food processing and fast food culture. The assembly line methods used to produce hamburgers for prisoners became the template for post-war restaurant chains, while the industrial dairy processing that created milkshakes for POWs evolved into the massive dairy industry that would supply American prosperity for decades. American food scientists and nutritionists used POW camps as laboratories for testing food preservation, preparation, and distribution techniques that would revolutionize civilian food systems after the war. The methods developed for feeding German prisoners efficiently and nutritiously became the foundation for school lunch programs, hospital food services, and industrial cafeterias that would feed millions of Americans throughout the post-war period. The cultural impact of American food abundance extended beyond individual prisoner experiences to broader questions of national identity and values. German prisoners discovered that American prosperity was not merely material, but philosophical. Americans believed that abundance should be shared even with enemies, demonstrating values that contradicted Nazi teachings about American character and motivations. The international implications of American prisoner feeding became apparent as Allied nations adopted similar policies based on American success. British, Canadian, and Australian prisoner facilities began implementing American-style food abundance programs, spreading American food culture throughout the Allied camp system and establishing standards for prisoner treatment that would influence international law for generations. The post-war economic advantages created by wartime food production capabilities positioned American agriculture and food processing industries for global dominance that would reshape international commerce. The technologies, methods, and scale advantages developed while feeding millions of military personnel and prisoners created competitive advantages that would enable American food companies to dominate global markets throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The transformation of German prisoners from skeptics to enthusiasts of American fast food represented more than culinary conversion. It demonstrated the power of abundance to reshape fundamental beliefs about national character, cultural values, and the nature of civilized society. Men who had fought against American forces across Europe discovered through hamburgers and milkshakes that their enemies possessed not only superior military capabilities, but also cultural generosity that contradicted everything they had been taught about American weakness and decadence. The irony was profound and historically significant. Adolf Hitler had promised his followers a 1,000-year Reich built on German superiority and enemy weakness. Yet German soldiers found themselves discovering paradise in American prison camps through the simple pleasure of abundant food. The Third Reich that had preached sacrifice and hardship was defeated by a nation so prosperous it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own civilians. The letters that German prisoners wrote home carried testimonies that undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than any Allied broadcast. When Weber described American abundance to his wife, when Dietrich explained hamburger construction to his family, when hundreds of German POWs detailed their generous treatment to relatives throughout Germany, they were providing evidence of American capabilities and values that no amount of German censorship could completely suppress. The human dimension of this transformation revealed truths about the nature of cultural exchange and the power of shared humanity. Enemy soldiers who had been trained to hate Americans found themselves laughing with American guards over milkshake techniques, learning cooking methods from former opponents, and developing friendships that transcended national boundaries. Food became a universal language that spoke more eloquently than any diplomatic negotiation. What would you have thought if a simple milkshake felt like freedom? Stories like these reveal how American abundance transformed not just battlefields but hearts and minds, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons are generosity and plenty. In the next episode, we'll uncover another hidden story of how American innovation changed the course of the war in ways the enemy never anticipated. Subscribe to discover more of these remarkable tales from the secret archives of World War II.